Hello, everybody. It's another Sunday night, the first new episode of Explain Yourself of 2025. And I'm really excited both to be going into a new year and to be talking to the creator about the book that we're going to look at tonight. I'm going to bring in Jake Weaver, who is the host of Midnight on Earth, which is a really cool podcast. Is also bringing a great comic project to us called Schism. Jake, I'll bring you in now. How's it going? Thank you for coming on the show.
Hey, thank you, man. I really appreciate being here. This is incredible. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
It's an honor to have you on. So I'm really pumped about to talk about Schism because it's got a really unique story. It's a continuation of an old story from the Defiant universe back in the 90s. Tell us about Schism.
Look, this is going to absolutely blow your mind. And I appreciate you having me on. I never get to talk about these things, so I'm so happy to talk about this. Look, Schism is one of the greatest pieces of comic book artwork ever. It's one of the greatest stories never told. Why am I saying that? Those are bold statements. Why am I saying that? The Defiant Comics universe, I'm going to tell you, the Defiant Comics universe was an incredible universe created by Jim Shooter and other very creative people. At the beginning of the 90s, it was like 93, after Jim Shooter left Valiant. Okay, I'm just going to give you a little bit of backstory. So when he left Valiant, and that's a whole comic book legendary story, but we'll save that one. After he left Valiant, he started Defiant Comics, where he was going to continue that legacy of quality storytelling, really deep, meaningful connections between the characters and a cohesive universe into that new company. Had that in the first part of Valiant, what they call pre-Unity Valiant, when Shooter was at the helm. The continuity, I mean, they were the ones that really pushed this incredible continuity back then in the early 90s. Defiant was coming, okay, summer of 93. And Marvel was already very scared because, Valiant Comics had scooped up such a huge chunk of the market share in that area. You go back, you look at the previews comics, like the distributor information, the preview, all the Diamond stuff, and you can see that all of a sudden they came out of nowhere and scooped up this chunk of the market share. So here comes Jim Shooter again to do it again, and boy, was specifically Marvel scared, but DC, they were just kind of like, whatever. So the Defiant comics went on and they were published and they were incredible. And we could talk about their history, but essentially as the books were progressing, things were happening. Defiant Comics had a legal battle with Marvel. Marvel tried to put them out of business using, I guess, what people call these days like lawfare. Essentially, they used a very, very tenuous connection to create a legal case to go after Defiant, the company's very limited resources, in order to bankrupt them. So they filed a frivolous case and against them. So in the middle of it, they're fighting this case, but the universe was continuing. There were several titles: War Dancer by Alan Weiss, Warriors of Plasm, headed by Jim Shooter and David Lapham. And we can talk about all of this. But as it was coming up to the first year, closing on the first year, they were building up towards this huge crossover, which was called Schism. Now, people who know Jim Shooter know that he was very famous for the Secret Wars project, right? Which was like considered one of the first big crossovers. Yes, there was Crisis on Infinite Earths, but Secret Wars is considered by many to be the first event within Marvel's comics. Okay. So then he's over at Valiant Comics and he does it again with Unity, which, by the way, there's a lot of history there. That was actually Diamond Comics suggesting to them that they should do a crossover. So they did Unity, and it was like a ridiculously huge hit. Honestly, it's one of the greatest comic crossovers ever. It's definitely in the top 3. It's one of the most cohesive stories, 18 chapters. So Shooter just knocked it out of the park. And Co. I'm just going to say Shooter and Co. Not to discredit any of the other great people that worked on it. Yeah. Shooter and Co. knocks it out of the park with Unity. So he's coming back again with Schism. That's like his strength, is bringing this energy together, these characters, and creating these mega epics. So they were working on it as Defiant Comics was trying to find other funding as their initial round of funding. And the second round, I think, got sapped up by the legal battles. And so unfortunately, even though they did a significant amount of work on this project, they did not get to release it before the capital was gone. Their business partner, the company, the River Group, they had problems with them. The whole thing fell apart. It's 30 years later now, but Defiant had to close their doors. It was terrible if you were a comic book fan at the time. I know several people of that era that quit collecting comics when Defiant was over. It was sad, man, because it was a very great, it was a very tight-knit universe. It had great storytelling. It was all building up to this thing, this schism, right? So they were working on this. 160 pages were completed, okay? Pencils and inks. Now, there's some comic legends, if you don't know, that got their starts at Defiant Comics. Charlie Adler. We know Charlie Adler. Charlie Adler didn't love comics. The guy's like a household name. Walking Dead, my God, they sold 1 trillion of those, okay? J.G. Jones, bro. J.G. Jones, the legend, okay? Started at Defiant. Jim Shooter picked him out specifically. He submitted something, I believe, and he just saw the talents. I read the interviews with him about this. And David Lapham, of course, he had a history already building with Harbinger of the early 90s and things like that. People knew about him. But Warriors of Plasm really cemented him as a true comic book artist before he went into Straight Bullets. So you have these legends there. Dave Turner started his career there, and others. So they're all working on this incredible series, Schism. And it was going to be the most promoted books of the summer for them. All of these young artists were hungry. They wanted to prove themselves and prove something. So they put their all and everything into these books. It got to 160 pages. They had the plot that was written by Jim Shooter. Got 160 pages of art pages done. And it was getting to the coloring stage. The covers were done. And it was getting to the coloring stage when Defiant closed its doors. Okay. Amazing story. Crazy story if you think about that, right? 160 pages. I mean, back then, you got to remember, this is pre-internet. This is when computers were barely being used in the comic book medium. Colors a little bit. It was like in the early 90s, yes, Digital Chameleon and the others. But ultimately, it was still in an analog form. Defiant Comics, how they produced comics was in an analog way. So all of those pages were hand-drawn, and they were all paid for at the time. So they were thought lost, right? You know, it's years and years later. You know, if you look on comic book forums of the era, people are wondering, oh, you know, whatever happened with Defiant, whatever happened with Schism. I heard there was some Schism pages done. It was like just this like rumor, like maybe a handful, because there was 5 pages that were released in promo material. So 5 pages were out there in the past. And then over time, about 5 or so more pages just leaked out. Like somebody had a private sale. They bought a page from J.G. Jones back in the day at a convention or something like that, right? And there was other things. And then, interestingly, 1 page surfaced that I'll show you right here. I hope you can see this. Oh, you can look at this. Okay, yeah. This was the first page that surfaced.
Oh, that's awesome.
This is where it gets interesting. Okay. This is Schism number 4, page 20. And if you notice, it's colored. And then that makes you go, wait a second. And if you didn't work there, this is pre-internet. They didn't even have a website. Nobody was sharing this information. So it was just like, poof, gone, right? So like, wait a minute. If they made it to issue 4, page 20, then that means they finished the whole thing. Like, come on, they're coloring page 20 of number 4. That means the pencils and the inks are done. You can't have the pencils and inks without the plot. And at the very least, right? So like, whoa, like where did these pages go? Okay. this is just me, the Defiant Comics fan, because I personally have always been a lifelong Defiant Comics fan. I thought it was an incredible company when it came out. I was a teenager. I bought every issue off the stands. It was very influential to me as a human being because the stories were so intelligent. They were intellectual. They had some great people involved. And I learned from them. There was a lot of really heady concepts. In the 90s, my God, some of the writing was like, you look back and it's like fifth grade level.
I love the art and I go back to it and I'm like, some of the jokes and the plot lines on some of my favorite books, I'm just like, boy, that's tough to not like detract from the experience. It's so much of an afterthought, the writing. So
it was just like they were trying to pump out product. Now I was buying comics during the speculator era. So I remember I was going to conventions. It was a passion. People don't realize, unless you lived in that era, just how many people were into comics in a passionate way, pre-internet, right? When you were like interfacing with art, you were looking at the page, you had a tactile experience, right? So like, that was the thing. Like that was that era. So, again, it was lost. Everybody thought it was lost. It was these little inklings dripping out over time. And, later on in my life started a podcast called Midnight on Earth. And it's, we talk about metaphysics and spirituality and aliens and the paranormal and theoretical physics, quantum physics, really heady stuff. And it's really positive. It's a great podcast. And it blew up, by the way. We'll talk about that maybe at the end. But my show, I was like, well, this is my show. Who's somebody I've always wanted to interview my entire life? Jim Shooter, the legend, the comic book legend, Jim Shooter, creator of Valiant Comics, creator of Defiant Comics, later creator of Broadway Comics. But I wanted to interview this guy, man. Oh my God, right? It was like, I loved that guy. I really loved his writing style. His stories were meaningful. They had impact. Most importantly, they had rereadability. You can read it 20 different times and still captivated. And 30 years later, 35 years later, in some cases, the stories still hold up. Look, I bought every Image comic in the early 90s as they were coming out. Youngblood #1, I bought them all. Do I go back and read those, and go, for like deep, meaningful, like escape or like fictional experiences? No, but those books still do.
It's not Star Trek, the original series. We're not going back for the characters and the mind-bending plots.
So here's the thing. The comics held up over time. And in fact, in some cases, they got richer, which is the Warriors of Plasm story and Dark Dominion and War Dancer. All of those got richer with time because of how the structure of comics became later on with how people write stories and the art and the digitalness. There's a richness there. And so I had Jim on the show and we talked the first time for like 4.5 hours. It's my longest episode to this day.
Oh, wow.
And we talked about everything because there's a lot of things that people don't know. There's a lot of things about Valiant Comics that people don't realize. There was some counterfeit Valiant Comics that made it into the back issue market. Jim trying to tell people about that recently. Some people didn't believe him, but then Janet Jackson, his longtime collaborator, backed him up. So that's out there. And then we talked about him coming back to be the editor-in-chief of Valiant Comics in the 2010s and 2007 to 10 era. So we talked about so much. So it was a long episode, but eventually we got to the Defiant stuff and we talked about Schism. So that was the first episode. And man, he told me, he's like, I don't know. I think there was only like a handful of pages done. He didn't even know himself how many pages had been finished.
Wow.
So just mind blowing, right? So like, because there was other art editors and there was other people like Janet Jackson overseeing the whole thing. So that he trusted. So the second time I had him on my show, I brought him on my show and I said, look, Jim, this is what I want to do. This is Jim Shooter, one of the greatest comic book legends of all time, literally almost like an archetypal comic book art form human. Like, anyways.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
I was like, we're gonna have the world's greatest Valiant Comics fan on, because these are his three companies. We're gonna have the world's famous or world's greatest
Mhm.
Defiant Comics fan on and the world's greatest Broadway comics fan on. And I had those three people on, which is Greg Holland of ValiantFans.com. He's been running that for 20 plus years, holding the Valiant frequency, helping it come back to life for a long time, you know. Excuse me. And then Defiant Comics, we had Jim Hollister come on, who is the curator of the Defiant Comics Museum in Arizona. So he has a space that in his home that he dedicated to Defiant Comics and made it very open
Yeah.
and
I wanted
displayed.
to ask you about that. When I was reading a little bit, I said, like, Defiant Comics Museum, where the heck is that? And
So
in
I'm sorry,
Arizona, obviously. Actually, I was out that way last year. I'm kind of sad I didn't know about that at the time.
he will happily arrange for you to take a tour. He has things that no one has ever seen before. If you love Defiant Comics, things like prototypes, early scripts, things that were never even produced, like a signature series, like, you know, very, very exclusive stuff. And he's been collecting for 30 years. Since that time, he's been actively pursuing people. So he's gathered stuff from employees of the River Group, old Defiant employees, and everyone that was involved. Everybody always tucks away something. Isn't that interesting? All these production people, the printers, the you know, the people that make the binders, people that make the cards, they're always like, oh, I'm just gonna stuff these away in the attic and sell them one day.
Sure.
And then they do. It's really interesting how these people do that. So and then for Broadway comics, we had Scott Braden come on, who's a veterans comic journalist, and he loves Defiant Comics and Value as well. Big Jim Shooter fan. So in the process of that, I found out that there were more Schism pages out there. Some people had them. Scott knew of some people, and, you know, I started looking. I was like, really? He's like, oh, yeah, they're out there. So, not to drop any names yet, because I don't want to have those people be flooded with messages, but excuse me, I had some great people helping me along the way. So one clue would lead to the next person, would lead to the next person. And over the course of like 3.5 years of like talking to old Defiant employees, talking to different people, talking to people that have bought original comic art pages and things like that, I was able to track down all 160 pages.
So you had to go through like almost one, I'm sure not completely one by one, but you had to go through and find every person that had these pages, get scans, see if they were willing to share them, all that stuff.
Well, that's where it gets a little different. Not exactly. That would be the dream. Some of them were actually original comic art pages, thank God, but some of them were not. Some of them were lost, you could say. The original art is lost. So some of them were like photocopies, fourth generation photocopies, pictures of pages. Like somebody had a photocopy on a table and then took a picture of it. So I had to piece all of those different types of puzzles together to get the complete 160 pages. It wasn't just finding the original art. It was finding just literally an image of the page itself, if that makes sense.
It does. Wow, that's wild. That is a lot of detective work.
Oh, dude, it was fun because I got to connect with pretty much everyone that ever worked at Defiant and other comic book legends, because they hired a lot of seasoned veterans. Jim was really good about working with people that knew the comic craft. And so I got to talk to a lot of those people. It was all worth it. It was all worth it. It took a lot of time and a lot of energy, let me tell you, but we got it all. But this is something we couldn't have done before, perhaps maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But now, with the way just computer processing ability has advanced since that time, it's way easier to rebuild pages that look like crap. You know what I mean? Like some of these pages, you know, let me find one that's particularly bad here. I have all the pages here. I'm not going to show you all of them, but we'll take a look. Hold on just 1 second. Let me find, you know, this is an average one, but we found a better version of this. You know, it's missing
Mhm.
some panels. We found
Okay.
you know, this is actually on the better side, right?
Mhm.
But then, so this is something that would be like the worst example of something, right?
Mhm.
But then we have a picture of this page completed. Okay, so we have a scan of this terrible scan we had completed. So then we were able to recreate that page correctly.
Mhm.
And then it's like, okay, now we can get it colored. It looks like it was actually how it did back then. So
Mhm.
it's not just like finding those pages. That would have been the dream, right?
Mhm.
That would have been
Oh,
the dream.
sure.
Oh, sorry. Hopefully that wasn't me.
No, I think I was wondering what that.
Sorry about that.
No, no worries. No worries.
But yeah, that would have been the dream, to have the pages in pristine condition. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. But we can bring them back to professional looking, you know, where it looks like,
Mhm.
wow, is it as good as it did in 1994? Or even
Yeah, and I
better?
think to give a little context, because I'm a little, you were a teenager. You said when these were coming out. I was
Yeah.
probably 11 or 12 in that area when I was like reading in like Hero Illustrated, Wizard, about Defiant Comics, about Jim Shooter leaving Valiant, and it was very. I think that the press that they got at the time was really good and kind of establishing, in context with the rest of the comics industry, which was Youngblood, Spawn, Savage Dragon, which I love all those, and just some of the more gimmicky, extreme '90s stuff. This was going to be real meat and potatoes, solid storytelling, solid continuity, a universe with a big plan that was really kind of seen as a counterpoint. And I think it's a shame that some of these companies didn't really last, which Jake mentioned earlier, because I think if you look at stuff like CrossGen coming up, maybe in the early 2000s, it shows, I think, the appetite for this a little bit more, not grounded necessarily. You get the big stories, you get the epic stuff, but just something that's a little bit more organized and thoughtful in its storytelling, and not necessarily just cool splash pages, cool characters.
Exactly. And honestly, as much as I love Jim, and I absolutely love Jim Shooter and everything they did at Defiant, I love everybody there. They could have did things differently. He wanted to literally, like you said, do quality comic books created with a quality comic crafts
Mhm.
method for people with the true knowledge, you know, with that. I mean, he started when he was 13. There were
Oh
people
yeah.
that when he was working with in DC that had started in the 1930s, bro. Like that's how deep that dude's knowledge goes. You can't replicate that. I mean, Zach Lynch of Blue Shack Comics, who was actually Defiant Comics' original intern, he's now the editor-in-chief of Blue Shack Comics. He calls Jim the living Stan Lee, and I'd have to agree with that statement. But those were what the ideals were: incredible storytelling, continuity, everything that you said. But if they would have done things like, hey, buy 50 copies, get a gold version of #1. I, as a Defiant comic books fan, would have been okay with that. Jim felt like it was too gimmicky. He's like, no, we can win this on stories.
Mhm.
And he would have been right, except for the market itself, the actual market
Yeah.
collapsed.
Y-
You know, in
yeah, and
general.
that's something I think, I think most people watching know how the bottom kind of fell out in 95, 96. And there were some rough times at all the companies. Defiant, I think when you had to stop before then, right?
They did, yes. They actually, at the summer of '94, they didn't even have a
94.
website, if you can believe that.
I can believe that.
You know, it was
I
like,
remember having to go on AOL to see the Maxes by Sam Keith. His had a page, and it had images, not elaborate images, but just an image of the Max, and it would load line by line by line. It would take about 5 minutes
oh yeah,
to load the page.
yeah. And then what was that, a 30K JPEG now?
Oh
You know,
yeah,
you're like,
it got even on
oh,
my
there it
nerves.
is. Like, wow. Yeah.
It was
One.
cool. I
Right,
was pumped. I'm like,
I
look at him, he's
agree.
right there. He looks cool. It
So
was
the
fun.
thing is, yes, and that era was amazing. And if you were there, you know how many people were just passionate about comic books as an art form. Yes, CrossGen did have some of that ethos, but they didn't have Jim Shooter. You can't
Yeah.
replicate Jim Shooter. that guy emanates comic book. I mean,
Oh yeah.
it's like teaching a kid to be Jimi Hendrix. You start young at 13. He understands the craft of comic book art, unlike most people alive today.
Yeah, I think that comics history is really. He was known in like all the magazines, and you'd see, and I know he had a lot of artists didn't get along with him. John Byrne, I think, and a few others. Although John Byrne, I don't think gets along with a lot of people. I think that his approach was kind of being challenged when I'd read, back in all the magazines and some of the websites at the time. I think history has kind of shown that people do care about continuity. I was never a big continuity guy until so much of the big two output really stopped paying too much attention to that. Not to say they completely threw it out the window, but there's so many Elseworlds. There were so many stories that didn't necessarily fit in a certain time frame or affect things, and it began to feel like everything mattered a little bit less. And I think that it's really borne out that approach that he has, where it's like, I think the apocryphal story is if a building gets blown up in the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man has to swing past it and say, oh, what happened there? That's kind of a small example of it, but I think that the continuity stuff, which I never quite appreciated until it wasn't taken as seriously, really does matter. It really does matter, even for books you're not actively following. You can jump back in, you can go back, and I think things have a little bit more gravity, which I think is what set the Defiant books, just when they were starting to come out and they were describing them. You knew you were going to get something that mattered, that the next story mattered, the story before it mattered. This was going to be a fun universe to get into, and something substantial.
Exactly, because honestly, you have a business as well. You want people to be coming back month after month. You want to create compelling stories that have meaning and depth so people connect with it. And when people connect with things, when people have that intimate, feeling with a story, they're going to love it and they make it a part of them. And then they're buying the books month after month. But if you look at the most treasured comics, even today, in comic book history, it's the Jim Shooter era. It's the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. Like those are the absolute most beloved comics. Sure, you could throw the 60s in there as well. And yes, there's classics every decade, but if we were focusing the energy, you could say that it's the 70s, 80s, and 90s are the most really beloved era of comics. These are the ones that are being replicated with these facsimile books. They're just reprinting those comics. Like I bought a stack of facsimile books recently. Every single one of them that was on the Marvel end, editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter, editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter, editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter. It's like that dude knew how to make comics that were readable. Okay, they're readable. Look, I love comic books as an art form. When I see comic books today as it's created by people that some of them do, but most of the people don't fully understand the comic craft, like the true dynamic understanding of the art. They can create flashy, beautiful images, but can they tell a story? Because you look at the most valuable comics, do they have incredibly flashy, detailed art with crazy, incredible human achievements as far as penciling or something? No, they're just incredible stories told well. You think about Steve Ditko, he was a legend at the time, but you look at his art, it's very, it's simple. It's easy to understand. Like that is the era that people resonate with. That's Jim Shooter's method. He understood that. This is why Defiant Comics was so important. They held that energy in the beginning of the 90s. Also, they were the last analog comic book company. They did not use any digital methods until the very end. They colored one book with digital chameleon, and every other book they created, it was like hand penciled, hand inked, hand colored, hand produced. Zach Lynch of Blue Shack Comics, he was a big part of that as an intern. He was there from day one almost till the end. And, he saw all of this. And those books are incredible. They're, yes, part of the 90s, but they still hold up.
Yeah, I'm always waiting for somebody in the Kickstarter realm or some indie comics place to kind of try and do that was such a specific style of coloring that just set, like, as soon as you saw the Malibu, Valiant, and Defiant books, they had that kind of watercolor coloring, and they were able to reproduce that just as well as the digital stuff in terms of your great. I mean, they had a million colors. They weren't just doing the Marvel thing where you had to say this is RC 0039 or something like that.
Right.
And which I love that too. Actually, it's fun looking back at those comics that aren't recolored. I'm like, there's some pretty cool stuff here that you don't necessarily see anymore, because you're always just people are gonna do either local color, which is like the color like Magneto's purple and red and
Right.
skin tone, or it'll be like all blue or something like that. It'll just be flooded with some kind of light. You really saw people get creative in strange ways when they had just those colors to work with. And then that's why I think Marvel actually bought Malibu or some part of it.
Yes, in the 90s, 95.
Because they wanted like, hey, we want to start, we know we're going to need to do something different with color. They figured out something that's looking cool. And that's something we're going to try and fold in.
Yeah, so essentially, yes, they bought Malibu in 1995, integrated the Ultraverse. They had, was it called Malibu Coloring? They had a company. It was one of the first
you're right,
coloring houses that did coloring of that era, like Digital Chameleon. And it was like ready to go. It was like plug and play. So like, oh, we'll buy this. On top of that, they wanted to create their own distribution network similar to Diamond Comics at the time. They did for a minute, which I believe was called Heroes Distribution.
It was like Heroes World or something like that.
Something like that,
tied into that, yeah.
And then but that didn't work out, and all those Ultraverse characters got shelved, or so that was a whole trip.
Those are so cool.
Yeah, but that's the thing. So Defiant, all analog. It was like the old school methods from the 30s, the 1930s, the 60s. Like that was all with Jim, and he had that energy in that company. Now, he created another company after that, Broadway Comics, with Lorne Michaels from Saturday Night Live.
Oh, I didn't know that. I knew about Broadway Comics. I didn't know Lorne Michaels was involved.
Well, he had Broadway Video. I mean, Broadway Video was the production company that produces Saturday Night Live. I think they still do. Or no, he sold it actually. But they did then. And then, but they used digital things then. So, and the legendary aspect of it, the David Lapham, J.G. Jones, and the coloring, like you said, it got weird for a lot of years in the 90s. It was like orange tones, really, but they were learning. I mean, Zach Lynch will tell you that, he left Defiant and went to start Techno Comics with some people, and he'll tell you he colored some of those comics. And he'll tell you, they were just kind of figuring it out as they went. Like they didn't know what they were doing.
You could really tell back then that some of the books I have, one of the books I'd carry out of here if my house is on fire is The World's Finest miniseries that Steve Rude drew, Dave Gibbons wrote, and I think Steve Oliff, if I'm correct, colored it. That stuff holds up, and it was one of the first really fully colored digitally books. It looked really good. You could tell you had somebody with real fundamental color skills doing that, not just flooding wild highlights and everything and filters. The lens flares you'd see on comics in the mid 90s for no reason were out of control. They didn't even look good as lens flares, but they also used inappropriately.
But I will tell you, and maybe you remember this, I'm a couple years older than you. It was a stark contrast to the 4-color newsprint colors. It seemed like it was like the Star Trek, The Next Generation. Like, oh my God, it's the future of comics. We were like, wow, this paper is glossy. Oh my God, the colors are popping. Comics to me now, when I see a comic from 2024, I feel like I'm opening up and it's like an animation cell. Like I don't even feel, it doesn't even feel like a comic anymore. Like that's
definitely something I've kind of stopped using as many like sort of color holds. I'll put some mist, behind something to create space, or at least I used to. And as I see more and more of that out there, I'm like, it feels a little bit less comic booky to me. I'm like, I want to get it as much like, I'll sit there and do that with my inks instead, which I didn't used to do, just because I'm like, I kind of want that to be less rendered, more like just feels like the old comics. It just has a little bit more weight to it. Feels like it belongs in that tradition of stuff. Because as much as I loved painted comics, I still love Alex Ross and stuff like that. When I see stuff that's just not necessarily looks like it was done in the 80s or the 60s, but feels like it could have been with some tweaks or with a little bit of polish, better printing, things like that, that's kind of where I want my books to be. And so I
Right.
really love to see that stuff.
Yeah, and if you notice, our colorist, Philippe
Mhm.
Arajo, he has that style. We coached him on the 90s watercolor style that was really, I guess, taken to its highest point by Janet Jackson. Her colors are so amazing. To me, she's the greatest comic book colorist of all time, analog,
Mhm.
because her colors were so dynamic that they couldn't be reprinted even with 90s technology. They couldn't capture the dynamics of it. So when you see her printed pages of that era up close, it's like it's like the most
Mhm.
gorgeous thing you've ever seen. It's like almost like three-dimensional.
Yeah.
It's just wow. So her style is amazing. That watercolor style, Philippe is using that style. He's using digital coloring. That's just where we're at these days. But
Yeah.
we did offer the job to Janet. She wanted to write it because she was the original writer of the time. But she's not coloring. But if you look at Philippe's style, I mean, he captured it perfectly, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it feels like those old, especially when you would just never see reds used in this way, like you do in that bottom panel there
Right.
in a comic today. But that does feel like something you'd see a lot in those comics.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And it's
this really
beautiful.
brings you to that point. And even this gradient you see here, this looks like the first few years where they had gradients being used. I'm like, yeah, it would just not that it's it just didn't it made enough sense, but it wouldn't be done today. They'd have some rationale to it. And I think they were still in the point, and this is a really cool thing about it, that coloring, that where you had people that knew how to do color, they knew how to complement stories and use color to tell the story, but you also had people that looked at it not necessarily like, okay, this white part here has to be a laser beam or something literal. It could just look cool. This is part of a graphic image. And I think you don't even see, you look at old comics, you just have a red background in the panel with some letters. It didn't have to be anything else than that. It could be a different color for no reason, just to pop. So I think you still had people that looked at it that way, and you got some cool things out of that.
Yeah, and that's kind of exactly the aesthetic we were going for. We really wanted to capture that. And it's easier in a way. We can, wax philosophic about comic art and art theory. It's easier in the way for the brain to process it and read the story. Sometimes when your brain's trying to define all these colors and images and squares and all of these things in a hyper detailed image, I'm not talking about Jeff Darrow. That's something totally different. But something highly detailed, then it's just like you lose focus and then you're moving on to the next image. So it's like you're trying to tell a story that has motion. Yes, you want people to check out the artwork, but there's a rhythm to it. And this is the classic comic book art form. This is the thing that maybe we need a refresher on. We need a refresher on in the comics books industry. This is the comics that people want. Clearly, they clearly want this style of comics. Like these comics that are selling now, you hear these stories. Oh, this one sold like 1 million because of this crazy promotion, or oh, this one had Keanu Reeves in it, so it sold like 650,000 copies. It's like, okay, cool. But the other ones, what do they sell? Nothing, dude. Compared to back in the day, like these sell like 30, 50,000.
Oh, that'd be a breakout hit, 30, 50,000, I assume.
Right. Oh yeah, an Image World is 10,000. Yeah, 10,000,
okay.
5,000. I remember when some issues of Spawn in the 2000, the aughts, they say, were like 5,000 copies, man.
Oh,
like
wow. I didn't know that. That's
some of those, there was a period where things were getting murky. But that's the thing. Why is that? Why is that when people are willing to go back and buy reprints of the comics of that era?
Yeah.
Why are they making comics
for some things?
Exactly. Right. So like, this is what people really want. They want comics this style. I'm happy to bring it back. Hopefully I'm not rambling, but I have another page to show you as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Like this.
I want to see that.
So this is an example of a page that we had to reconstruct.
Mm-hmm.
You can see it's like not inked. It's like a second generation photocopy, but we were able to make it look exactly how it was intended. It's absolutely beautiful. So that's just some of the things that we had to do in the whole reconstruction of these books. It's a labor of love. I love the medium. I love Defiant Comics. These books should have been released. They're too historical. I mean, we're talking about like David Lapham. Okay, let's talk about David Lapham for a second.
Actually, let me take a quick break here. I have to play
Okay.
a quick commercial here, but this is a good time to do it because I want to talk about David Lapham. I'm so
Yeah.
pumped for that.
All
Before I do, I wanted to call up this comment. What's up from Project Neosis?
Yeah, what's up?
This is from Paul Thayer, who was on the show a little bit ago. Has a great superhero book that is just like kind of what we're talking about now. It's very modern, but also has just awesome meat and potato storytelling. Really exciting book. So if you're watching this now or later, definitely check that out. I think you can still get a bunch of issues of his at a ton of different places. He really covers everything. But let me play a quick message from our friends at All Ages of Geek.
Click that mouse and warp into All Ages of Geek's website, your ultimate portal to everything geek culture. Here you'll find articles that speak your language, from the latest anime buzz to the coolest tech trends. Our mission, to celebrate geekdom in all its glory. Whether you're a gamer, a comic enthusiast, a 90s kid, or an anime aficionado, we've got something for you. Dive deep into them with All Ages of Geek.
All right. So we mentioned David Lapham, who drew, for me, I really noticed him on Agents of Plasm, or I'm sorry, Warriors of Plasm. That artwork was everywhere. It was really one of those iconic images for 90s comic collectors if you were into like all the companies and not just Marvel, DC, Image. And his work is heavily featured in this, correct?
Absolutely. In fact, he was the architect of the Defiant universe with Jim Shooter.
Okay.
Here, one of them anyway. David Lapham's books, Warriors of Plasm, which originally was titled Plasm, and then after the lawsuit with Marvel Comics about Plasmer, right? They were trying to put him out of business. The comic they said infringed on their copyright was a Marvel UK book called Plasmer. Total BS, right? And then so they changed the title from Plasm to Warriors of Plasm. And
it's actually a lot better.
Yeah, in fact, it did hit a little bit harder, everybody said. And it's some of the greatest comic book work ever. If you like comic books as an art form, if you understand when I say this word, what this means, comic booking, like just like
it's not a precise phrase, but I know exactly what you mean.
Just the true nectar of the art form, right? The freaking nectar. That's Warriors of Plasm. David Lapham just went full steam ahead. Jim Shooter was writing the initial arcs. His art, inked by Mike Witherby, who is longtime comic books inker, is absolutely stunning. It's breathtaking. He did his best work of his career at that time, and it still holds up over this time. It's one of the most richly detailed world building, the most insane world building you've ever read in a science fiction epic. Incredible. It's just mind-blowing how powerful this comic book is. I mean, it deserves to be up there with the greatest comic books ever, that series. And even as it goes on, there's these 2 issues specifically, because David Lapham, we all know he became far more popular with Stray Bullets. I mean, it's critically acclaimed, has been for a very long time. 8 and 9, Warriors of Plasm number 8 and 9 were both written and drawn by David Lapham, and they're 40 pages each. So it's like 80 pages of comic book bliss. And it's just like, it's such a well-crafted story. It's so beautiful. It's like, I look at it every year. So I just pull out those books and just look at it, because it's like why people like comics. This is like, oh, this is why people like comics, because of comics like this. This is the nectar of the art form. So that was incorporated into the Defiant universe. I mean, there were other books as well, like Dark Dominion, that was created with and for Steve Ditko, but with Jim Shooter. So you had Stan Lee and Steve Ditko creating Spider-Man. You have Jim Shooter and Steve Ditko creating the Dark Dominion character. Michael Alexander, essentially Glimmer. All of them are a part of this and a key component to this huge Schism story.
Yeah, that's awesome. I remember his artwork really being, and Jim Shooter, I think, took pains in every interview I read at the time, and I read everything. back then, would say, like, I think I remember a quote literally from 30, 40 years ago. He said, like, I don't know if I'm Stan Lee, but this kid is the next Jack Kirby. And I remember thinking that wasn't necessarily super hyperbolic. I mean, I love and still love Rob Liefeld's art and Eric Larson, Todd McFarlane. But I did also really appreciate the way that this company and the artwork, specifically the creative side of it, kind of positioned itself. When you looked at the cover for Warriors of Plasm, and the card series was a big part of it too. I remember when they launched. Right. It was it was kind of George Perez plus, is how I remember it. It was a little more dynamic in terms of the angles than sort of like your old George Perez. George Perez is maybe a little bit more a step above the people on your Rich Buckler, your that kind of tier, Alex Saviuk of Marvel artists who are like, yeah, this is good, but it's not like really in your face like a lot of the art you come to expect from the late 80s and early 90s. And this stuff, I'm like, this is solid. It's up there. And I was a kid then, but I could see this. I'd look at people like Steve Rude, who I'm still a huge fan of, and people like David Laff. I'm like, okay, this is kind of what more comics is supposed to be. This other stuff is cool. I love Stephen Platt. Even if I can't tell what's going on the page, I still look at that stuff and I'm like, I think it's as cool as I did when I was 11. But
of course,
I look at stuff like this, even at the time, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is good stuff. And they also didn't really, there was a book coming out at the time. You were already seeing other books position themselves as like Image Comics are stupid, which never went over well with. I remember Harlan Ellison was releasing a book with Dark Horse. I think it was called Dream Corps. It was an anthology.
Yeah, yes.
The whole point of it, as cool as it looked, it could have sold just on its art and his name. It was like, Image Comics sucks. Here's what you should be reading. And it just didn't seem right to me. When you'd see stuff like Defiant and Valiant when Shooter was there, kind of just quietly putting in the work. Hey, this is really solid art. You had Barry Windsor Smith, you had David Lapham, you had Bernard Chang was starting out, I think.
Right.
All that stuff is as impactful to me and was at the time as, your Jim Lee X-Men cover Spawn 1, all those really iconic things. So I think it had everything there. It had the really cool visuals, but it also used those visuals to say, hey, this is a story that's going to make a lot of sense. It's going to matter. And like you're going to revisit it.
Exactly. And there is an art to storytelling. All of those people that you named, all of those artists, I love those artists as well. And I loved them back then. And it's just a different type of comic book art. You can love it all. You can love all of it. But there's something about the essence of the medium and like what makes comic books special. Because to me, and I said this on the podcast with Jim, that comic books are the marriage of arts and literature, right? These are some of the most valuable art forms that we value as humans on this planet. We love literature. Boy, do we love literature. We value our authors. We put so much energy into literature. And guess what else we love? We love art form. We love music too, but we love art. We love physical art. Some of the art in the world is worth hundreds of millions of dollars for just one image. We love art so much. My God, comic books are the marriage of art and literature. Why don't we value them in that same way? They haven't hit their full potential yet. They've been utilized in ways that have accessed some of their potential, but comics as an art form still, I believe, is in its infancy. There's still, the best is yet to come for comics, I believe.
I agree completely. I mean, I remember people kind of thought like, kids are getting into video games. I don't know if this is going to still be cool in 10, 15, 20 years, or if people are going to want to see it. Clearly they do. Mangas, even if the American comic industry isn't necessarily doing well, and I don't have the numbers. I don't know for sure, but that's something people talk about. Manga's doing very well. Clearly there's an appetite for images and pictures, or images and stories together.
Yes.
And I think if you look at what you need to be so deliberate with comics. If there's a sound effect in there, you need to think about how big it's going to be. Somebody's made that decision. How big is this panel on the page? Just your basic Scott McCloud stuff. Everything about a comic page is deliberately done in a way that you don't get in a movie even necessarily, or a novel.
Let me tell you this though, really quick. One thing about Valiant and also Defiant that was part of Jim Shooter's ethos is they had no sound effects and no thought balloons. Okay,
I
so
don't
all
remember
the
that at all. I mean, I did never that never stuck out to me. Wow,
that was one
that's
of his
cool.
biggest rules, and that's what gave that a little bit more maturity. Now,
Mhm.
there would be internal dialogue, but it would be like in the letterbox, right?
Okay,
Versus like
they're
a
the
thought.
first ones to do that. All right.
Yeah, so
Hmm.
that was so you know, that was also Steve Ditko. They had a vote about that actually. I heard this story. They had a
Oh,
vote about it at Defiant, and they're like, should we use sound effects? And then Steve goes like, everybody uses sound effects. We don't need to use sound effects. Then he walked out of the room. He was part of Defiant at the beginning, actually, which is a
I
really
was
interesting
ask,
story.
how is that? How did they get him to like participate in that? I mean, I would almost think that I would have just imagined that they just were like getting pages from a courier and nobody ever saw or talked to him. But he was involved in the kind of conceptual stuff of this.
Yes, absolutely. And here's the thing. Jim Shooter will tell you that Dark Dominion was created by and for, with and for, I should say, Steve
Mhm.
Ditko. He was deeply involved. It was crafted specifically for him. And you have to remember, Jim Shooter was working at DC. He worked at Marvel. He became an executive at Marvel. I mean, if you're a comics professional and you're trying to get paychecks for your work, you know, you kind of know these people. You network. Plus, let me tell you, Jim Shooter absolutely loved and still loves Steve Ditko. He thinks he's absolutely, he was like, I don't know if idolize is the right word, but he was like, it was almost like a mentor, like kind of like I'm talking about Jim Shooter in a way.
Sure.
So he had a connection with him. And then, you know, he was always getting him work. So when at the end of a little bit of comic history here, at the end of Marvel's, in the end of the 80s of Jim's tenure at Marvel, you know, he had Steve Ditko working on ROM and things like that, random
Mhm.
comics. But, you know, he kept getting him work. We worked at Valiant. He worked on some Magnus books, some other little things, even at the beginning, kept getting him work. So when he moved over to Defiant and he really had creative control, he made sure that Steve Ditko was involved.
Yeah, that's cool. So I actually, and this kind of ties into what you were saying about all of Marvel's, I guess, sort of dirty tricks at the era, which were a little bit more overt with Defiant. I actually got into Steve Ditko's work because they were flooding the stands with reprints of classic stuff for maybe a quarter less than the regular books or something like that. And I loved those. I started picking those up because I'm like, this was just the original Ditko Spider-Man, and then they were reprinting kind of, I think, your Paul Smith era of the Claremont X-Ren. And I started buying that every month until I realized kind of what Marvel, like I read in some of the either comic scene or Hero Illustrated was a little less reverent to the big two and would say like, yeah, they're just doing this to, they just want one more image book not on the shelves. And I think that's kind of crappy. Um, but that's kind of what introduced me to Ditko. And I'm like, I loved those old Spider-Man comics. Which you'd think as a kid, I was probably 12. You know, it'd be like, this isn't Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man or something like that. But I gravitated to that stuff right away.
Right. Because it had the storytelling. And that's
Yeah.
the thing. Like, you know, people don't remember that era, those books. Like, even though they were flooding the market, there was a little bit of good that came out of it because you got turned on to that. But people don't remember there didn't used to be graphic novels in the library. Are you out of your freaking mind? They might have like one, bro. Like one. They didn't have. Now you go, what, every city in America, there's a graphic novel section of like 800 graphic novels. They didn't have that. If you were a kid in the 80s into the early 90s, they didn't have that at all. They didn't have reprints of everything. Are you kidding? They barely reprinted anything back then.
Mm-hmm.
They had some things, but you had to hunt down the back issues. It wasn't just like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, boom, here's the trade. It was like, what, we're at issue 15? Oh, let's do a trade for 1 through 4, maybe. Like, you know what I mean? People don't realize, the comic collectors of today, or even the last 10 or 15 years, don't realize how much they have now. And I'm not even talking about the digital comics and everything that's out there at a touch of a button. We didn't have any of that.
Yeah, it's really, I'm not a huge collector by nature. I mean, when I moved to New York City, I pretty much had to get rid of most of my comics. I think I kept like 3 boxes of my like cherished Man of Steel run and some other things, but I've never been a big collector. But there's still something fun if I'm at half price books or something like that, or a comic shop with boxes. If I can find an issue of X-Men or something that I had the one before and after, I'm going to pick up that one that I never got to read. I've probably read it digitally since, but like, I'm going to pick that up. I like that stuff.
I do
That's still a
too.
fun thing to do.
Yes, and Portland, Oregon, where I am at right now, we have the incredible, I'm going to give them a plug, Excalibur Comics, the oldest comic book shop in Portland,
Ooh.
Oregon. A beautiful selection of back issues, incredible. And here's the thing, like I go there all the time, and as we as humans, culturally, as a species, as we get more into that digital age, those tactile things like the comics, they feel more special. My
They do.
God, like I was looking through some Robotech comics. My daughter, I have a daughter, she loves Robotech. We got some of the old Comico Robotech comics. I'm opening up, the inks were gorgeous. The paper quality was gorgeous. Like just the experience of looking at it in the printed page itself was amazing. Like that was part of the experience. You know, there is something really special about that. We just have to bring it back. We've got to bring printing back from China. That's a whole different thing. That's a whole different topic. But look, I want to
And now we get to the politics section of the show.
well, I want things ethically printed. I want people paid for their work. I want people paid for their work. I want, you know, let's use lead-free inks. Let's get people paid for their work. That's all I'm saying. I'm a humanitarian. I love humans. But real quick on the schism thing, before we go too far off on a tangent, because I love talking with you so much. You know, once we knew we had all the pages, we knew that we could and we knew we could remaster them. That's when we went forward with the Kickstarter. Janet Jackson committed to write it because she was supposed to write it the original back in 1994. She was the original writer. So she's back on writing it. And we still had Jim's plot, which was amazing for all 4 issues, the original 1994 plot. And the best part is Jim Shooter himself is coming back on as a consulting editor. So he's going to go over everything. His energy is a part of it. And Pauline Weiss, who is married to Alan Weiss, who created War Dancer, one of the Defiant books, and comic book legend, by the way, in his own rights. She's coming on as a script consultant. So we have all the pieces together. We have all the pieces together. By the way, we're printing in the USA, but we have all the pieces together to make sure that we can get this out there, because it is truly not just a lost piece of comic book history and not just the closing chapter of the Defiant universe, but it's a lost piece of artwork, human, beautiful artwork. We're recovering that. We're bringing it back from the ether to now with this Kickstarter.
It's amazing that something like this, I mean, I don't want to say it was just out there, because if you really had to drag this back into existence from so many different sources, I feel like that does a little bit of discredit to the amount of work you've put in. But that this was out there, that this was created, that this was drawn, almost finished, and just went into a drawer somewhere, more hypothetically, is crazy. This was such a big part of 90s comics. And it's just awesome this can come back. Tell us a little bit about, and I want to mention, people watching now or later, if you're watching this on YouTube, the link to the Kickstarter campaign is right in the description. I've thrown it in the comments as well. So if you're watching this on Facebook, you can click it and head right over to the campaign. But tell us a little bit about some of the options as far as what kind of like actual rewards we can get from, and ways we can get the story here on the Kickstarter.
Wow. Okay. So this is where it gets amazing. We really wanted to do this correctly. And because these comics are, again, as we were saying earlier, from the pre-internet era, I don't want to sound like some like curmudgeon-y old man to these kids that love comics. I love you too. I love comics. We all love comics. In the pre-internet era, you had to hold books in your hand. Okay. So we kind of geared the options toward having printed material. So there's a physical version of all 4 issues, and each of the books, let me tell you people, each of the books were 40 pages, right? So you have 4 40-page books. Do the math. That's 160 pages. Okay. And you have the 4 beautiful colors by David Lapham, and we have the physical editions. We're encouraging people to go towards those physical editions. It's like, come on, just get the books. We know you like the digitals. Go for the physicals. People are still supporting us with the digital option, and I appreciate that, but we have that. So the 4 books are available physically, and they're also available digitally. Now, one person on the internet, I'll just say one person, was wondering why there wasn't a big price gap between the digital and the physical issues. I'm going to say it again. Get the physical issues. It's fine. But if you really don't like those, if there's some reason you just can't do it physically, you have the digitals, and if you pay that amount, you know that you're supporting the project. You're bringing something out of the ether. Like we were talking about, literally it was like pulling it out of the ether. Like all of a sudden I get this phone call. Oh, this one guy has this. Oh, he got this email from the year, 2002 that had 4 of the pages in an attachment. I got to go dig up the time machine save from the you know what I'm saying? It was literally on that level, bro. Right? Wow. Okay, so you're supporting us. Okay, you get the digital, and so you get the physical, and then we have a beautiful, beautiful hardcover edition, which will have all of the content of everything, all the covers, all the pages. There's going to be an afterword written by J.C. Vaughn, who's the president of Diamond Comics right now. Don't let me forget to talk about J.C. because his whole career is tied to Schism. This is going to blow your mind, okay? We'll talk about that after this. So we have this, including the afterword written by J.C. Vaughn and Scott Braden. It's going to be incredible. It's going to be on better paper stock. So it's going to be deluxe paper stock, all the pages together, cloth bound. And the Schism logos were progressive. Like each one opened up a little bit as they came out. So we're going to maintain that, and you're going to have the 4 progressive logos on the cover. Then there's the remarked edition, which is very limited, and it has an inner cover drawing by Janet Jackson. Now, not only Janet Jackson's a goddess on every possible level. She is just an amazing woman, creative, she just exudes creativity. That's why her and Jim just worked together so well for so long. They were just creative people. She's an artist. She's a writer. She's an editor. She's so many different things. So she did a lot of, again, I believe one of the greatest colorists of all time, if not the greatest. She's going to do some remarks on the inner covers, which are going to be beautiful. So each one is going to be individual. And, there's the collected packs. We have packs. Look, some people like to buy everything. We love the support. Thank you for doing that. And they're what some people would call not the completest, but the completest-ist, as they say. I don't know if you've ever heard that before.
No, it's a good term.
Yeah, for people who love it all, they love Defiant and they want to support us. And we've had some people back us on that. And my God, do I appreciate those people.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I mean, it's such a unique thing. I think that this could exist, through all the work you've done to make it. You should have made a documentary of your.
Tell me about it.
Just process doing this.
I mean, flying to the museum, finding people, the synchronicities that happen, a lot of synchronicities, little miracles, happen that made me really realize how much this was meant to happen. For instance, let me just tell you about this one. We were putting it together. We kept finding more pages. First we were 18 pages short, then we were 10, then there were 7. We got down to 1 page. And just before we launched the Kickstarter, the day before, we found the one lost missing page. I was like, are you freaking kidding me? Right? So it was so amazing, right? So we have all the pages. It's so awesome. Yes, it was an incredible feat. And I do want to point out how much Zach Lynch of Blue Shack Comics helped me. He, again, started his career at Defiant Comics. He was an intern. He was working with Jim specifically. It was almost like his right-hand man, but he was there with everyone as well. I mean, he was there flying proofs to Canada as a teenager. He was 18 or 19. He was an intern. Wow. They paid him in Subway tokens. He has a whole story. He actually, he came on, I remember now, he came on as the surprise guest when I had the Valiant Defiant Broadway guys on with Jim Shooter. I brought Zach on, and that was part of starting it as well. So all of these people came together, including him. He did just so much help. And then J.C. Vaughn, president of Diamond Comics, literally, dude, president of Diamond Comics. J.C. Vaughn was a huge help. And he started his career in 1994 with Overstreet writing an article.
Okay.
About Schism. Okay. That's the funniest.
Wow.
That was his
Cool.
first professional work ever. Was an article written about the books Schism that were coming out that summer, 1994. Now he's the president of Diamond Comics.
That's so cool. I just love, I mean, this is something we completely lost. I mean, we kind of had it when Bleeding Cool and CBR were a little bit more of the hub of comics information, but even that wasn't as satisfying as like you'd get these like all these magazine articles from Wizard, Hero Illustrated, Comic Scene, Overstreet. You'd get those little newsprint things that were just given away for free in the comic shop that would have like a page about, hey, this is what's coming out next year or this summer in most of the cases. That was such a big part of being a comics reader in the 90s and the 80s that I just love and miss. And I think that's why it's so cool to see something like this just rematerialize. Again, with a great deal of effort on your part.
Thank you.
That this is, I mean, it's insane that people couldn't appreciate this, and what a real service you've done, I think, to bring this out and get it to people.
Thank you.
Into those stories, and this is, I mean, this is just an awesome thing you've done here.
Well, I want to ask you, have you ever heard of a project even like this before, where dozens of pages, an entire 4-book series featuring, a handful of comic book legends that was almost printed, never printed. It's incredible. Magnum opus. Like, okay, just real briefly, if you read the Defiant comics, they're incredible. And then you read this and it's like to the next level. It's like the movie version. You know what I'm saying? It's like, oh my God, you don't even realize how good this is, like how good the Schism books are. Have you ever heard of anything like this before? Some recovery effort like this?
I don't think anybody's going to see anything like this again. And I just don't think there's ever anything that's like this has happened before, especially like I said, this isn't just like a mini series with a couple of characters people liked. This was like the big event for 94. This was going to be the thing everybody read about. That all the stories built towards, and with that universe, they were going to build towards it, not just have it like happen. So I think just not only that I think it's unique for all the reasons that I just mentioned, but I think more so, if this was a lost, say Marvel Comics forgot, whatever reason went under, they found a comparable story. I don't know that the continuity was as strong there, just because they had so much stuff. With this, I think it's even more meaningful because everything was so tightly tied together. There was so much discipline in keeping the universe coherent and related, that for this to be a book that can kind of finally come out, I think is more meaningful than any other instance, any other way this could have unfolded. Wouldn't quite have been as cool.
It's and you think about the past and future comic book legends that worked on these books, and then the amount of pages, 160 pages. It's just like every page is like nectar. It's just gorgeous. Like, let me try to find one more page before we go. I know we're running out of time here, but let me find something really juicy here.
No, I'd love to see these pages, man. This is so cool.
It's just, and these are just my photocopies. These were the first photocopies that I received. Oh, yes. Look at this. Okay. So here's the page. Not to give away the story too much, but this page, showing Chasm ripping the heart out of Michael Alexander of Dark Dominion, the main character, Glimmer. What happened here? Look at this. J.G. Jones, bro.
Wow.
J.G. Jones, never even seen. I'm just telling you, I love these artists. I love the comic book medium. And that's the thing. If you love comics, if you love the medium, the art form, the craft, and the people who literally created the craft and nurtured the craft, this is like the pinnacle of that. This project is the pinnacle of that, an expression of that. This is a true expression of that.
Yeah, and it's so cool to see, especially to go back to some of these artists who were just starting out, especially guys like J.D. Jones. If you look at work from that era by guys like him, by Brian Hitch, who are still doing great work now, it's so cool to see how they started out. Obviously, reference wasn't as obtainable or easily used. The styles were different. You kind of see a little bit of what you recognize as their style now coming out in old pages. That's another thing I love about going back to read old comics, is to be like, oh yes, this is one of the first J.H. Williams comics that I think he had done. It's cool to just see that. Yeah, I can kind of see where this thing started that he does. And I think you got so many creators on this book. I'm an artist, so I'm always going to gravitate to the art side of things. You got so many instances, I think, of that happening in this book. So that's, I think, another big draw among very like a plethora of reasons to pick this up.
It's historical. It's historical. It's legendary. You're truly supporting the art form if you support this project, and you're going to get rewarded 10 times more than any money that you put down, because the history, like I said it before the interview, the thing is dripping with history. It's just, my God, it kind of makes you shed one tear a little bit. You're like, oh, it's like, but then we can bring it back. There's new companies, there's new people that feel inspired in that same way. They'll revive it. They'll bring it back. Comic books have been with us for thousands of years. Thousands of years. Comic books have always been a part of our history. They're archetypal. Pictures and words together to tell a story. What do you think hieroglyphics are when you go to see the Great Pyramids? Those are comic books. There's pictures. There's words. They're telling a story. Okay, it's been with us since the dawn of time. Comic books are huge. It's one of the greatest art forms we've ever created as humans. And this is an expression of that, like I was saying earlier. But in general, it's the art form. We love it. This is why we love comics.
Yeah, I mean, that you preserve some part of this is just like such a service, I think, to people that really appreciate the art form. I mean, I think we all get into comics for different reasons. I like saw Superman the movie and was blown away, and I see the artwork in the comics. Loved it, for those reasons. I love the characters and the plot lines and I guess the lessons it taught in some weird way, as a kid. And then it's the art form that really kept me into it as an adult. You appreciate the things you can do in comics that you can't do anywhere else. And I think that books like this are, even at the time, I could tell this was a publisher that was doing those types of things, that wanted to fit within the tradition of comics. So to go back in and fill in a really glaring blank spot in the history of this company is, you asked me the question earlier, has anything like this ever happened? And I said, no, I can't imagine it has. I also can't imagine that it would.
Yeah.
And the only thing I can think of that's comparable is they had like maybe half of, if you got that JLA Avengers Absolute Edition, they had maybe 50 pages of George Perez pencils of the first time they tried to do it.
The original version.
Yeah, it was a totally different story. I don't even know who wrote it. Maybe it was
I think it was John Byrne, actually.
Oh, really? Is that right?
I believe so. I could be totally wrong. This is like 30-year-old comic knowledge.
Oh, wow.
Its head. Wait,
you could be right. I know Perez drew it, and I remember it was awesome to see, and I thought it's insane that you have 50. Oh, actually, no, there was again, it was Perez. There was a graphic novel that him and Wolfman did for the Titans that was completely shelved that they brought back a few years ago. And I think that's the closest thing that's ever happened. And as cool as that is, for it to be a foundational crossover event for a publisher that's not around anymore, that had such a strong identity, but was also an important part of the 90s comic scene.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think anything comes close. So,
like I said, it's a foundational part of comic book history. It's a cornerstone of the analog moving into digital world with the legends. It's just you're right. There's nothing like this. Sorry to interrupt there.
No, I don't think that's hyperbole at all. It really is. I don't think I could say it any better. That's exactly what it is. This is something that you just can't get anywhere else, and it's the real thing. It's not like inspired by, as cool as that is. It's the real thing. It existed, and you've dragged it back into the real world for us. So thank you for that, and for also coming on to tell us about it.
Thank you for having me on your show. And I will say, there's been people that have literally come up to me in tears about this.
Oh, sure.
We've talked about this, like, my God, because comics are very meaningful when people grow an attachment to these stories, these people, these characters. It means something. That's part of our experience on this planet, to love, to grasp onto these things and to appreciate art and literature and all of these things. This is part of why we're here. And, if people support this project, they know they're supporting a piece of comic book history. They know they're supporting these artists. Because I just want to add before we go, this is a 100% volunteer effort. Okay. Every dollar that gets past production and all the things that it takes to get it in your hands will go back to the original creators.
And
So
that's
it
great.
goes
That's
over
great as
the
well.
goal. Yes, dude, this is a tribute to everything. This is a tribute to comic books. This is a tribute to the era. This is a tribute to the love of the comics. This is everything.
Yeah, I can't say any better than that. So
Well, thank you, man. I
if you're
really
watching this now or later, head over to Kickstarter. The link is in the description. It's in the comments. You can head over there. You've got 55 days to go, so there's plenty of time left, but that doesn't mean you should wait. You could go ahead and back it right now. This is a unique opportunity. I don't think anybody's ever going to get to fund something like this again. I don't think you get to discover something like this again. So if you were a fan back in the day, I don't think there's ever going to be something as cool as this. If you came into comics later, I think this is something you'll really enjoy jumping into. So I certainly loved it back at the time and thought it was an important part of the comics that were coming out. So again, what an awesome book, and what a thing you've done. Just, like I've said, pulling this back into existence so people can discover it.
Hey, man, thank you. And I couldn't have done it with all the help. Zach Lynch, J.C. Vaughn, Scott Braden, all of the people that helped me get to this point, all the old Defiant employees, the artists, the writers. I appreciate them as well. Thank you again for having me on the show.
Thank you for coming on. This is it's a real treat to talk about just the comics of that era. And what a fascinating story it is, just the way you've brought it back. So very cool. And I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, well, let's revisit this when it's released.
Absolutely.
We'll just have a little recap.
I can't wait. That would be great.
All right. Well, bless you, my friend. Thank you.
Cool. Before we split, I want to show a couple things to everybody watching. My co-host Joey Galvez is just about to launch this Make 100 campaign for our Archetypes magazine. This magazine is a love letter to Wizard and Hero Illustrated. So everybody watching now, head over there, get in that pre-launch list so you'll be the first to hear when we do launch. You can also head over to Archetypes issue 1 and 2. You can pick up, this is still available in late pledges, so you can get issue 1 and issue 2. Again, this is if you were a fan of Wizard or Hero back in the day, you're going to get some comics in this book. You're going to get articles about comics. We really tried to take what was fun about those magazines and reinterpret it for the modern indie comics scene. So you can get my Fangoria homage cover. You can get the regular cover with this character from Jonathan Hendricks' story, and this one from C.J. Hudson's story. A lot of cool stuff there. So head over to that. The links are in the description. Actually, let me throw the link for the Make 100 campaign in there. So if you're watching this now or later, you can click right over and get on the pre-launch list for this one. My book, if you're watching, let me get back to that. Share my screen again. All right. Here we go. I just shut down late pledges for Cobalt Crisis, but we're going to launch the pre-launch campaign hopefully this week. I'm still waiting to get my final approval from Kickstarter, but keep watching this space. Everyone, probably next week we'll have the pre-launch live, and you can get on the list for when we launch this, hopefully in the next few months. I can't wait to start this one up. It's basically Crisis on Infinite Earths if it had happened in the golden age of comics. So all the pulp atmosphere, all the epic stuff, and that you get in Crisis or Secret Wars. It's kind of serendipitous that we had you on this week. We're dealing with a lot of the same themes, but I think this is going to be a really fun, unique story. We can kind of do all the stuff that you get from those stories, but kind of look at it from a golden age inspired viewpoint. So I think it's going to be unique. It's going to be fun. It's going to have a lot of surprises. It's going to have guest stars that you know about or you've heard of that you've never seen in things like this before. So everybody watching, head over to my Kickstarter page. I think that link is also in the description of the show, and you can follow and be the first to hear when we launch the pre-launch for this one. All right. I think that is all our housekeeping for the week.
Wow, those comics looked amazing. Cobalt
Thank
Crisis
you.
was fire. Wow.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm drawing the first issue now. I want to have the first issue done before we launch, so I can send people the digital the day of if they want to read it. Hopefully people will. And yeah, couldn't be more pumped.
Well, thank you again, Fred.
Thank you again. I think that does it for the week. Everybody come back next week. We'll have more great indie comics to talk about. And Jake, I just want to thank you again for sharing not just the incredible comic, but the incredible story that kind of entailed that you had to go through to bring this one out to us.
Well, thank you again. Thank you for having me on. And like I said, let's recap after it releases. We'll tell some more stories. I have stories for days.
Love to do that. Yeah, I could listen to 90s comic lore for hours on end. So thanks again for coming on, and everybody watching. I hope you had as much fun talking about this as I did, and we will see you next week.